Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. In the previous episodes in this series, I talked about the emerging of the socialist realist method in architecture and the reconstruction of Moscow. During that same time period, there was another very significant debate in the USSR regarding city planning. Three contending tendencies appeared. There was the Marxist tendency, the so-called urbanist tendency, and the so-called anti-urbanist tendency, sometimes also called disurbanism or deurbanism. The urbanists wanted cities that were much more dense than current ones, while the anti-urbanists generally wanted to eliminate cities altogether. The Marxist position was that cities should not be destroyed, but crowding should definitely be lessened, while the countryside should be further developed to minimize the contradiction between town and country. The urbanists and anti-urbanists seemed like opposites, but in reality both really wanted to destroy or abandon existing cities. The urbanists wanted to replace them with ultra-dense, futuristic megastructures, while the anti-urbanists wanted people to live in big villages, in isolated cottages, or in very sparsely populated settlements. The Marxist position was that historical cities ought to be reconstructed, but they shouldn't be abandoned or wiped out. There were also some smaller trends regarding urban planning, like the so-called linear city, developed by constructivist Okhitovich and N.A. Milutin, where the buildings were built in long strips along a road, and its variations like the parabola city, developed by constructivist V.P. Kalmykov and rationalist Ledovsky. There were also very vulgar pseudo-Marxist ideas spread by the urbanists and anti-urbanists, such as the claim that different kinds of city plans belong to different kinds of modes of production. Of course, there's some basis to it, but they generalized it way too much and claimed that, for example, if a city had a grid pattern, then it was capitalist, while if a city had a radial pattern or a circular layout, then it was a feudal city. Therefore, such cities should be abandoned, and entirely new, quote-unquote, socialist cities should be built from scratch, which would have some kind of completely different layout, such as a parabola, for instance. The Marxist position rejected all of those ideas, generally considering that when deciding the plan of the city, different factors must be taken into account, such as the existing historical structure, geographical limitations, rationality of locating industry, services, and transportation, etc. As Marxist architect Kolli pointed out, most of the urbanists originated from the rationalist Asnova group, which I talked about in episode 2, while most of the anti-urbanists belong to the constructivist OSA organization. Capitalist writer Hudson writes, quote, "A Central Committee resolution establishing the party's official position on the housing problem, published in Pravda on 29th of May 1930, said, the past culture was not to be totally swept away in order to prepare the ground for the new. The Central Committee accused the proponents of radical urban social and architectural reconstruction of concocting half-fantastic and extremely harmful attempts to overcome in one leap the obstacles of the socialist transformation of life. The Central Committee condemned calls for the collectivization of feeding and housing, for the collective education of children in isolation from their parents, and for the abolition of the family, all labeled harmful and utopian. Yuri Larin and Leonid Sapsovich were singled out for special condemnation." Unquote. I already talked about those ideas previously, especially in the constructivism episode, but basically both the anti-urbanists and the urbanists wanted to basically completely destroy the existing social system, root and branch, and immediately communalize all living and eating, and also immediately destroy the family by separating children from their parents. But these ideas were considered harmful and, at the very least, extremist and unpractical by the Communist Party. Capitalist writer Bader writes, quote, "The 1931 Communist Party decree effectively limited the terms of reference to development based on a moderate reworking of the existing urban form, rather than presuming a new capital to be built from scratch, as proponents of both the urbanist and de-urbanist movements might have wished." Unquote. So all these things kind of go back to what we've been discussing in previous episodes regarding prolet cult and Bogdanovism. Bogdanov basically said that the existing society should be destroyed to create a clean slate, and then the socialist society or the communist society could be built completely from scratch. But the position of Marx and Lenin was always that everything reactionary from the past should be eliminated, sometimes gradually if it couldn't be gotten rid of immediately, and then whatever was useful and progressive and usable from the past should only be developed and not destroyed. This discussion regarding feeding, housing, and the family is a good example. The constructivists wanted to force people to live in these barracks where nobody had their own kitchen, people didn't really have many personal belongings at all, and they basically just had a very small room where they could sleep and maybe read, and that was pretty much it. Everything else was collective. And also they wanted the children to be separated from the parents. But that was simply way too extreme. Assuming that there was some kind of useful outcome for that, the population nonetheless would never agree to it. And another good example is this discussion about the cities, where both the urbanists and anti-urbanists basically thought that the existing cities are somehow corrupt and should be destroyed, and new population centers should be built completely from scratch. But I would argue that that's completely reactionary to just destroy everything that we have. But also, it was just completely unfeasible, not to mention pointless. Everybody did agree that socialist cities would be different from capitalist cities in some ways, but the Communist Party position was that the existing cities should be reconstructed and changed instead of just destroying them. And that's what I talked about in the previous episode, in the episode about the reconstruction of Moscow. Hudson writes, quote, "The party declared that 3 stages of failure had characterized town planning in the past. The initial projects to come out of the revolution had borne the imprint of bourgeois planning practices. In particular, they had not been based on realistic economics, and had not reflected the socio-economic and political profile of the development of the town. Rather, with their individual cottages, they mirrored English 19th century ideas on the garden city. The discussions of the early 1930s revealed little progress, according to the party. English bourgeois theories had been merely replaced by petty bourgeois utopian concepts of the city of the future, and left deviationist ideas on the elimination of the contradiction between the town and the village, which paralleled Western capitalist efforts to resolve the contradiction of the city on the basis of an ultra-imperialist economy. The most recent period, the final stage of failure, had produced mechanical functionalism, giving rise to boring schemes of geometrically arranged regions devoid of any architectural organization of space within nature. These failures were now to be overcome in the unified artistic ideological form of the socialist city." Unquote. So this deals with a lot of the things that were discussed in previous episodes. The English 19th century ideas, such as the garden city, those refer to what is basically a predecessor of anti-urbanism. I'll talk about that more in just a bit. That kind of idea existed in the 20s. Then in the 30s, there were these left extremist ideas, like let's just destroy the existing cities and replace them with some kind of ultra-futuristic super city. And then the final stage of failure, the mechanical functionalism, creating boring, sort of inhuman geometrical schemes without any artistic value. That's obviously talking about constructivism, and if you want to learn more about that, you should check out the constructivism episode. But the geometrical city planning schemes, I'm sure they're referring to linear cities. It's also very reminiscent of something like Le Corbusier's Radiant City. Soviet author Perchik writes, quote, "At the June plenum of the Central Committee of the CPSU in 1931, Stalin severely criticized the trend towards bourgeois urbanism, which proposed to develop Moscow and other great cities of the USSR along the lines of capitalist cities, without limiting industry and the influx of the population. At the same time, he criticized petty bourgeois anti-urbanism, which denied the very principle of the city and sought to reduce the cities and change them into small settlements of the rural type." Unquote. One of the principles of Soviet city planning was that industry should not all be just concentrated in the biggest cities for a couple different reasons. First of all, because they didn't want insane levels of crowding, so that's why there should be enough jobs everywhere so that people wouldn't have to all concentrate into overcrowded cities. And at the same time, developing industry everywhere more evenly helps to minimize the contradiction between the town and the countryside, and in general is just more fair and democratic. But secondly, in the Soviet Union they also wanted to place workplaces and industry in those places where it was economically rational to do so, which means if it's a plant producing some kind of product, it would make sense to locate it close to the consumers so that you wouldn't have to transport the goods an insanely long distance, and also place it close to the raw material sources, so every republic and every region should develop industry based on its own raw materials. That's very different from the economic logic of capitalism, because sometimes such projects could be quite costly. Building a plant close to the raw material resource might be in the middle of nowhere, so it would require a lot of investment to build the plant there, and it would eventually of course pay itself back, but it would take a very long time. Whereas under typical capitalist logic, capitalists would typically want to develop industry where it's most cost effective, which basically means in regions that are already industrialized. The general plan for the reconstruction of Moscow says, quote, "The Central Committee of the CPSU and the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR reject the projects of preserving the present city intact as a museum city and of creating a new city outside the limits of the present one. The Central Committee of the CPSU and the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR also rejects the proposals to demolish the existing city and to build a new city in its place according to a totally different plan," unquote. Those were two ideas that were floating around. The anti-urbanists wanted to destroy Moscow because they wanted to destroy cities altogether, but the urbanists also wanted to destroy Moscow so that they could build some kind of high-tech, futuristic Moscow on top of the ruins of the old Moscow. And there was also the idea that Moscow should be abandoned and turned into a gigantic museum city, but all those ideas were rejected as completely unpractical. Then let's look at anti-urbanism more closely. The ideological leader of anti-urbanism was named Mikhail Okhitovich. Hudson writes that, quote, "Mikhail Okhitovich's writings were to shape the social and political theory of constructivism for the remainder of the movement's existence, and thus deserve close study. He began his analysis of the city not with a concern for technological modernization, which had previously marked OSA's discussions, but with regard for proper theory. His logic, simple and thoroughly Marxist," and here you can see Hudson's bias, because actually Okhitovich's logic is not Marxist at all, but Hudson, who is an anti-communist, constantly tries to defend Okhitovich, so he says, "His logic, simple and thoroughly Marxist, held that every form of settlement, including the grouping of individual houses in cities, resulted from social forces, that is, the existing social relations of production and the social definition of necessity. No natural forms of settlement existed, only social ones, and old social forms could not conform to new content. The city must perish in the ruins of the capitalist mode of production, for the city was a requirement of trade capitalist society. When these requirements vanish, so will the city, their product. The city is the form, the condition of the social relations of capitalist society," unquote. So here you can see kind of the vulgar Marxist, mechanist mindset of the constructivists. They had this idea called the social condenser, meaning that people's way of life could be changed kind of structurally by changing the types of buildings and the type of city layout. So they kind of ignored people's consciousness. They thought that people behave a certain way just because of the types of buildings or type of city layout that they live in, or they thought that the consciousness arises from that city layout. So if we just change the layout of the city, we'll change people's behavior completely. Of course, he is correct that settlements arise historically based on economic conditions and material conditions, but it's not so simple that a particular type of settlement or layout of buildings perfectly corresponds to a given mode of production. There could be a number of reasons why a certain kind of city layout emerged. And also, obviously, if the city is ancient, it could have been built during slavery, but it could have survived to the modern era. It doesn't mean that it's a slave-owning city. Nowadays, it would probably be a capitalist city. If the city was built recently, then it would reflect the newest capitalist city planning trends. So you could have two cities that are in capitalist countries that have capitalist modes of production, but they have a very different layout. And also city layouts are probably not identical in all countries, even if they have the same mode of production. The same very vulgarized and simplified, dumbed down logic is used in his argument that cities arose because of trade capitalism and therefore they have to be destroyed. Because of course cities arose already in ancient times. Some cities arose as administrative centers, while other cities arose as centers of trade. He's not entirely wrong. Cities did arise mostly because of trade, and when commodity trade develops to its highest form, it becomes capitalism. But trade is not always capitalist, and not all cities developed that way. And even if they did, it still wouldn't make sense to draw the conclusion that therefore all cities have to be destroyed. Capitalism also is responsible for developing industry. Does that mean that communism doesn't have industry because industry arose due to capitalism? Okhitovich is following Bogdanovich logic. He's not following Marxist logic. The Marxist logic is that if there's something from the past that we can still use and is still viable in the future, then we should use it and we should develop it and just get rid of the parts that are reactionary. But he's saying, no, if it arose in capitalism, we have to destroy it completely. But if we do that, if we destroy everything that arose historically, what do we have left? Nothing. Even the proletariat, even Marxism arose under capitalism. Socialism itself is something that develops out of capitalism. So Engels wrote in a letter to J. Bloch, and he said the following, quote, "I qualify your first major proposition as follows. According to the materialistic conception of history, the production and reproduction of real life constitutes in the last instance the determining factor of history. Neither Marx nor I ever maintained more. Now, when someone comes along and distorts this to mean that the economic factor is the sole determining factor, he is converting the former proposition into a meaningless, abstract, and absurd phrase." So what Engels means is that, of course, economic conditions and material conditions are what ultimately determines why things happen and how things develop. They are the root cause, but of course things develop in complicated ways based on historical conditions, based on things in the superstructure. Sometimes they develop based on foreign influence. If something happens, it doesn't automatically mean that it happened directly because of an immediate change in the mode of production. The situation is not as simple as that. The mode of production is not the immediate direct cause of everything, it's just the root cause. Perchik writes, quote, "The right reactionary wing of these planners sought to leave old Moscow inviolate, just as it was when the nobles, merchants, and priests ruled it. These people were opposed to the reconstruction of Moscow since it entailed the demolition of certain edifices of an historical and architectural interest, even though they were of no great value and stood in the way of the socialist reconstruction of the city." So he's saying that the right-wing anti-urbanists said that Moscow should be abandoned so that it could be preserved. He goes on, quote, "The so-called left wing avoided the task of reconstruction and proposed to build the capital on a new site, thus leaving old Moscow intact. As we see, even in the sphere of planning, there is a very close connection between the right and the so-called leftist petty bourgeois ideologists. In 1920, the ideologist of kulak counter-revolution, Chayanov, wrote a book called My Brother Alexei's Journey to the Land of the Peasants' Utopia. In this book, he dreamed of a counter-revolutionary coup which, according to his almanac, should have taken place in 1934, and which was to lead to the deliberate destruction of Moscow as a city. The following is the policy in the sphere of the so-called development, or more correctly destruction of cities, and of Red Moscow in particular, about which this openly kulak ideologist dreamed. So this is what Chayanov writes. "At first, the reconstruction of Moscow was influenced by reasons of a political character," wrote Chayanov. "In 1934, when power was firmly in the hands of the peasant, that is, kulak, parties, the Mitrofanov government, convinced by many years of practical experience of the danger of a great concentration of people in cities to a democratic, that is, counter-revolutionary or capitalist regime, decided on a so-called revolutionary measure and promulgated the famous decree concerning the destruction of cities with a population exceeding 20,000 inhabitants. Of course, it was most difficult to carry this decree out as regards Moscow, which in the 30s had more than 4 million population. But the stubborn persistence of the authorities and the technical equipment of the engineering corps made it possible to cope with this task in the course of 10 years. In 1931, the streets of Moscow began to be deserted. The engineering corps proceeded to plan the new Moscow. Moscow skyscrapers were destroyed by the hundreds, often with the use of dynamite. The most daring of our leaders, wandering about a city of ruins, were prepared to confess themselves vandals. So dire was the picture of devastation that Moscow presented. However, the unremitting struggle continued." Unquote. Perchik continues, "With the victorious march of the proletarian revolution, this farrago of utopian banalities, the fantasy of the ideologist of kulak vandalism, calling in his pamphlet for a farmstead system of economy, for the destruction of cities, for the founding of so-called cultured monasteries, and similar obscurantism, has been completely shattered. Enemies of the Soviet Union did no little damage in the matter of reconstructing Moscow, not only in theory but also in practice. For a whole decade, 1920 to 1930, in the planning of Moscow, practices prevailed which militated against the interests of the socialist reconstruction of Moscow. In the reactionary plans of those formerly in charge of the planning of Moscow, the city was to grow to 200,000 hectares so as to preserve the old city intact. They strove for a territorial separation of the political center from the workers' quarters, disposing it in a diametrically opposite direction. The architectural treatment was to be based on the style of old aristocratic residences, squires' country houses, churches and monasteries." Unquote. Marxist architect Mikhailov writes, quote, "Comrade Kryukov quite rightly connects this theory of deurbanization with the program of the kulak's ideologies. The idea of disurbanism preached by our constructivists now appears before us in a special light after the article by E. Yaroslavsky, Dreams of the Chayanovs and Soviet Reality, Pravda, 18th of October 1930, issue 288. It turns out that the saboteurs also asked themselves the question what to do with large industrial centers, with a politically mature proletariat, with the emergence of large cities, large industrial centers. The ideologists of kulak democracy resolved this issue quite simply." And then he quotes Chayanov, who writes, "In 1934, the first purely peasant Council of People's Commissars was organized, which passed a decree on the destruction of cities. The decree boils down to the fact that the existence of urban settlements of more than 20,000 people is prohibited. Workers of plants and factories are scattered throughout the country and, having dissolved in the sea of peasants, lose their political role." Unquote. Kolli writes, quote, "Disurbanists were preparing with one stroke of the pen to eliminate the opposition between city and countryside in Soviet Russia and propagated a very simple recipe for how to get rid of the contradictions of the capitalist city. There is no need, they said, for either a city or a village. The development of mechanical transport and technology in general under socialism should provide each person with an individual home in the midst of nature. This thoroughly reactionary petty bourgeois theory of individual settlement was borrowed from the Italian futurists of the fascist persuasion. If you read the Italian magazine Futurismo for 1928 to 31, you can find a complete analogy to the writings of the deurbanists. The theory of deurbanists, as we know, found its chimerical embodiment in projects for the construction of a green city and the transformation of Moscow into either a museum town or a giant park, with residents resettled outside the city along highways." Unquote. So it's again about this idea of a garden city, which is a very loose city, barely even a city at all. It's more like an enormous park, and also this idea of a museum city. Marxist architect Alabian criticized the anti-urbanists, quote, led by Okhitovich. These he charged with borrowing their ideas from Italian fascists. These wreckers attempted, among other things, to place housing as close as possible to unhealthy and dangerous locations adjacent to factories. This would ensure that the health of the workers and their families would be undermined and thereby arouse displeasure with Soviet power." Unquote. The petty bourgeois property owner nature of anti-urbanism is demonstrated by the fact that Okhitovich advocated that everyone should have, quote, a little individual house with a personal car, unquote. Now, although socialism doesn't prevent people from having separate houses, cities and population centers are obviously more collective and more socialist forms of living than isolated houses. Living in isolated houses is clearly something which prevails in pre-industrial society, while both in capitalism and socialism, people increasingly live in apartment buildings of various kinds. Of course, it's possible to have separate houses too, but it's not feasible or progressive to force everyone or even most people to live like that. It was also completely beyond the resources of the USSR at the time, or at least they would have had to spend tremendous amounts of resources just to allow people to live in such an inefficient way. The notion that everyone should have a private car might be even more reactionary. Obviously these days, because of CO2 emissions, people are increasingly seeing that public transport makes more sense than private cars, and that private cars might have to be completely eliminated. And in socialism and communism, the vast majority of travel would surely be via public transport. The idea that everyone should have their own car was also incredibly wasteful and totally unrealistic for the 1930s USSR, and is another demonstration of Okhitovich's petty bourgeois anarchist mindset. The anti-urbanists demanded that they must have their own car, their own private house, their own private everything. They didn't want the collective to quote-unquote limit their freedom, and they didn't want collective ownership either. According to Bader, the anti-urbanist model, quote, was predicated upon near-universal use of the automobile, unquote. Many Marxists at the time also called anti-urbanism fascistic, and it's quite accurate because, of course, fascists at the time supported it, but even these days, fascists tend to advocate it. The modern fascist utopia is to move into a private farmstead or a private cottage in the woods and raise lots of white children isolated from society, which they deem to be corrupted. In their isolated farmstead or cottage, they want to make women stop working and just become housewives stuck inside the home, and they also want to homeschool their children. Another more moderate, somewhat more realistic model suggested for a city was the so-called Garden City theorized by British reformist utopian socialist Ebenezer Howard. The Garden City was an influence on the anti-urbanists. The city was supposed to be very extensive in space, and it was supposed to be very low in population density, consist of a series of rings. Some rings contained industry, pierced by green slices. Crawford writes, quote, "Worker housing and everyday life" by P. Kozany proves that the revolution did not quell Russian interest in Howard's settlement form. The book's sole solution is the proletarian Garden City. Kozany argued that because land holds no fiscal value in socialism, there was no economic pressure to build tall. Furthermore, the underdeveloped Soviet construction industry was best equipped to build low-rise cottage-style housing on the Garden City model, unquote. It's not really wrong to say that land holds no inherent fiscal value, but even in socialism it does make sense to build tall sometimes, just if you have to increase the population density. Because even if land holds no inherent value, if the city is really spread out, it just takes a really long time if you want to go to the city center, for instance. So it's also about convenience and rationality and not only about the price. And I also find it interesting that Kozany so explicitly says that because the Soviet construction industry in the 20s was not really equipped to build tall concrete buildings, so therefore they should just build these small cottages. That's a very clear example of how a lot of these ideas directly came out of technical limitations, like I mentioned in previous episodes, where the very bland functionalist buildings just came out of material limitations, but some people romanticized them, saying that no, this is actually the ideal building for all times and for all places, or the kommunalkas or the communes during the Civil War, where people just had to share apartments because they didn't have the resources to build enough apartments. And then some people romanticized that, saying that this is what communism is, even though it was just sort of an inconvenient material necessity that existed temporarily. Kozany at least acknowledges that the Garden City idea came out of their technological backwardness, but then that just raises the question, what about if you just develop the construction industry? Then you could build concrete buildings, you wouldn't have to build cottages. So the Garden City idea was not really workable either, and it wasn't approved, but it actually wasn't totally rejected either. Some experimental areas were considered in cities like Moscow, and several garden settlements, but not entire cities, were created around Baku in the 1920s. The idea of a city with a very low density was deemed reactionary, but the idea of green zones was still utilized in all Soviet cities to protect people from pollution, and recreational park districts were created for people to enjoy. So, although that idea wasn't really fully implemented, it was kind of critically assimilated. Then let's look at the ideas of the urbanists. The proposals of the urbanists were possibly even more unworkable and reactionary. The urbanists wanted everyone to live in huge barracks with no privacy of any kind. The people should live in buildings without private kitchens and barely any personal belongings. The only personal rooms people should have was their bedroom. Ikonnikov writes, quote, "For Sapsovich, the eventual goal of development was visualized in the form of a dense transport web spread uniformly over the country and providing the basis for a uniform distribution of cities with average population ranging between 50,000 and 60,000 and in some cases reaching 100,000. The new city as visualized by Sapsovich was a single production, housing and cultural entity with all the population housed in 15 to 20 huge multi-story blocks of flats which provided only bedrooms for the adults. Centralized catering was to be assured by community kitchens and canteens, and recreation, education and the upbringing of children by other types of public buildings. The new habitat aimed at emancipating people from the cult of things. Furniture and bedclothes were available to a person in the house, plates and dishes in the canteens, and books in the library. Devoid of streets or separate housing blocks, it is a space with giant buildings of 15 to 29 stories rising above the treetops," unquote. So people would live in these half a dozen giant high-rise buildings, 30 stories tall. The children would be taken away, and although people would have their own bedroom, they literally would not have anything else private. Even the bedclothes were simply provided by the commune, they didn't own any of that. Same with dishes and plates and cups, you would just go to the canteen and use them. If you wanted to read, you'd go to the library. You wouldn't have your own personal books either. Some of those ideas, of course, are not terrible. The idea that the population should be spread somewhat evenly or somewhat uniformly, and that there would be community kitchens, and also the combining of production, housing, and culture into one entity. Those are not all terrible ideas, but just the way they're laid out just makes them completely impossible to implement and makes them outright reactionary. So even if some of those ideas in some form maybe wouldn't be so bad, the end result is just absolutely terrible. And again, the major problem with this is that if the people volunteered to do this, then sure, why not? But the problem is that the population would not agree to this, so you would have to force them. And it would be really, really tough to do that, and it would be totally pointless. So when the Central Committee described this as, trying to jump directly into a communist form of living in one leap, that's pretty accurate. In reality, this development would have to be much more gradual, and I think even then the end result wouldn't be this. They would gradually develop towards communism, and some of these ideas would be implemented, but the end result wouldn't look like this. It wouldn't look like a giant skyscraper where everybody just lives like monks in a monastery. Hudson writes, quote, "Nikolai Krasilnikov made the urbanist position the foundation for any future work. He wrote, the basic factor that determines the essence and physiognomy of the town or any type of population center is the maximal concentration of people living or working in it, and dependent on the type of settlement, the maximal density of buildings within tolerable limits. We will consider this factor as basis and peculiar to all towns and settlements, and it will serve as the starting point for analysis." Krasilnikov's proposed new socialist city had a density of over 750,000 persons per square mile in the central zone, with population density decreasing as one moved out from the city center. The total population would be a staggering 500,000 permanent workers in an area of 1.2 square miles. Movement in the center would be aided by helicopter service to roofs and moving sidewalks, unquote. So this is again just more of this sci-fi BS. Like, Sapsovich's idea was that the city would just consist of a couple of huge skyscrapers, but at least the city would be 50 to 100,000 people. But Krasilnikov's city is similar, just way, way bigger. Imagine a city where in a square mile there's 500,000 people living there. I don't know if this is true, but according to Wikipedia, Manhattan, which is one of the most densely populated locations in the world, it has 80,000 people in a square mile. But Krasilnikov is suggesting that we should make it like 7 or 8 times more, have 500,000 people living in that area. For what reason, I'm not entirely sure. But saying that it's too dense would be the understatement of the year. And then of course he says that for movement people would use like sidewalks that are basically conveyor belts and also helicopters. But obviously I don't even have to explain why that would be completely unrealistic even today in any country, let alone in the USSR in the 1930s. Here are some other utterly ridiculous design ideas by the urbanists. Tsapenko writes, quote, "During these same years there was a lot of talk about a new city, quote-unquote designed by a certain Lavinsky. This project has surpassed everything possible to imagine in the most incredible and absurd fantasy. The entire city was designed in the air in the form of buildings floating above the ground, allegedly through the use of the electron splitting force. The land, according to this project, is free of buildings. It was intended only for labor and excursions. Communication with the ground was provided using projectiles in the form of a combination of a car, an aircraft, and a submarine. After moving on land, through the air and underwater, this projectile lands, enters one of the hotels also floating in the air," unquote. Udoviki Selb gives another similar example. He writes, quote, "One of the pretexts for closing the Skutin, which I think is the Moscow Art and Design Institute, included its supposed lack of technical instruction provided to the students as they allegedly worked on outlandish projects incompatible with the needs of the country. A case in point was the lavishly designed Georgy Krutikov's futuristic thesis project of flying cities that could be compared with today's space stations. The units of the cities were served by small space automobiles," unquote. Bader says about both the urbanists and the anti-urbanists that, quote, "The vast majority of schemes propounded under these labels were simply utopian. Many presumed complete reconstruction of the existing urban system, most assumed almost unlimited financial resources," unquote, which of course did not exist. It was clear that the schemes of the urbanists and anti-urbanists would never be accepted by the Marxist government, and indeed they were allied to the counter-revolutionary Trotsky-Bukharin opposition. Capitalist author Frederick Starr writes, quote, "Sapsovich, who was an urbanist constructivist, and Okhitovich, who was an anti-urbanist constructivist member of the left opposition, shared the left's belief that change should be immediate and total. Kaganovich was therefore quite correct in linking them with the now heretical views of the fallen Trotsky. On the other hand, their belief that violence was neither necessary nor desirable links them squarely with the right, that is, with the position of the discredited Bukharin," unquote. Both the urbanists and anti-urbanists' reactionary character was also demonstrated by their reformism and their opposition to revolution. This reformism, according to Starr, quote, "had ample precedents in the annals of political thought, notably in the visions of French utopian socialists of the early and mid-19th century. Other aspects of the planners' work recall these same sources, as, for example, their negative emphasis on society as a tool for liberation, the creative instincts of the individual, and their passionate rejection of the city per se for the sake of the small town or countryside. And in the final analysis, how greatly do Sapsovich's communal dwellings differ from Fourier's phalansteries, and how much does Okhitovich's so-called new form of settlement differ from Proudhon's rural anarchy? Both comparisons were drawn at the time, as were equally telling analogies to the works of Rousseau, who obviously wanted people to return to nature, and Lev Tolstoy, a Christian anarchist, and the turn-of-the-century English utopian Ebenezer Howard," unquote. One could definitely argue that studying the utopian socialists could give us some ideas about building communism, but the utopian ideas should be examined very critically and not accepted wholesale. But much worse was the fact that the urbanists and anti-urbanists used the utopians to try and advocate reformism and opposition to class struggle. When the whole country was building socialism, the anti-urbanist Trotsky-Bukharin oppositionists claimed that socialist construction and collectivization should be halted. Starr writes, quote, "To face squarely the urban migration would have required the anti-urbanists to acknowledge that the mass of peasants trudging with their bundles from the Kiev and Kazan railroad stations had been driven to the metropolis by a force more fundamental and universal than their own optimistic theories, namely by the desire of the rural poor everywhere to seek jobs and a better life in the city. This they could not possibly accept, neither as communists nor as participants in that much broader movement of European intellectuals who, from the Enlightenment down to our own century, have believed the modern industrial city to be a transitory evil, faded over time to wither in favor of some rural or rural-urban utopia. Rather than confront evidence that challenged their entire teleological system, the anti-urbanists increasingly heaped the blame for their troubles on the Soviet government. At their mildest, such planners would chide drafters of the five-year plan for their failure in 1926 and 1927 to consider the impact of new industries upon cities and on housing resources. In their more outspoken moods, which were frequent, they would criticize proposals to build a subway in Moscow, a quote-unquote city without a future, belittle continued development of Moscow along the lines of the urbanistic and bourgeois plan for a Great Moscow, devised as recently as 1925, and flail the five-year plan as a whole for designating so much of the new construction money for existing major centers and for projects devoid of revolutionary vision. As one spokesman put it, our construction of cities, and among them the new ones, is shot through with a petty bourgeois spirit of the most banal of banal sorts, unquote. So that's how the anti-urbanists described the plan for the reconstruction of Moscow and the five-year plan in general. They said that it's pointless to build a metro in Moscow because all cities are going to be destroyed soon anyway. Hudson writes, quote, Mikhail Okhitovich joined his architectural criticism to a transparent condemnation of collectivization and championed the needs of the village, arguing that only through the dispersal of industrial production throughout the countryside and the economic development of the village to parity with the city could genuine communism be established in the Soviet Union. Okhitovich had heavily influenced the thinking of other modernists. The son of a former Tsarist bureaucrat, Okhitovich had joined the party in 1917. Later he was expelled from the party for membership in the Trotskyist opposition. The anti-urbanist Trotskyists also tried to argue that the USSR could not build socialism, and that, therefore, the Soviet cities were capitalist and not socialist, and thus should be destroyed. Hudson writes, quote, At the June 1931 plenum of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, the party joined the attack initiated by VOPRA, that is the Organization of Proletarian Architects. Lazar Kaganovich, arguing in his report that all cities and settlements in the Soviet Union had become socialist as a result of the October Revolution and the subsequent nationalization and abolition of private property, he declared that to deny their socialist character was to sponsor the Menshevik position adopted by the opposition at the 14th Party Congress. Kaganovich roundly condemned arguments for the reduction of the size of large cities. It does not need to be shown that talk of the withering away, the self-abolition and the reduction of cities is sheer nonsense. Indeed, it is harmful. Unquote. Obviously, like I said in the previous episode, eventually the growth of the cities was restricted, but during the first five-year plan, they built 40 new cities, and also the existing cities got a lot more industry because the country needed to become industrialized. So after that was done, the growth of cities ought to be restricted, but when the industrialization had not even begun, talk about destroying cities or not building new cities or destroying the existing cities was just not reasonable. How was the country supposed to become industrialized if that was done? Hudson writes that Marxist architect Mortvinov criticized Okhitovich, quote, for his Trotskyism, revealed in his analysis of the content of Soviet architecture. In evaluating Soviet architecture from 1918 to 1933, Okhitovich concluded that it had been a-national or anti-national in form and capitalist in content. That's obviously basically a slanderous reference to Lenin's and Stalin's idea that socialist realism is national in form and socialist in content. So Okhitovich is saying that actually Soviet architecture is anti-national or non-national, and it's also capitalist in content currently. He continues, this argument of the capitalist character of Soviet architecture, Mortvinov declared, is the very one that we have heard for many years, starting with Trotsky. It was simply, he continued, a negation of the socialist character of Soviet architecture, part of a larger Trotskyist assault on the socialist character of Soviet cities and industry. Failing to look beyond certain formal issues, such as the continuation of the single-family apartment with its private kitchen, Okhitovich and others of his ilk had concluded that there was no difference between housing in the Soviet Union and that found typically in any capitalist country. Such a blatantly counter-revolutionary declaration completely denied the socialist content of Soviet architecture. They do not look at how workers previously lived and how they now live, and do not look at how now we do not have landlords who in the past exploited their housing as well as other things. They downplay the entire class nexus and declare that we have resolved problems in a capitalist manner. That is to say, they have approached these matters in a typical formalist manner, and thus this denial of the socialist character of our towns and housing links Okhitovich to the counter-revolutionary positions of Trotsky. Hitting his stride, Mordvinov concluded that Okhitovich had already, in 1929, set forth his anti-Marxist-Leninist theory of deurbanism, a clearly social fascist point of view, unquote. Okhitovich also used Trotsky's arguments to claim that Russian culture was inherently backward and inferior, and that the USSR should instead make its culture non-national and import European culture. Okhitovich declared that trying to develop national culture, the way Lenin had instructed, was actually fascist. Quote, Okhitovich now tied, or rather tried to tie, Stalin's architecture to that of fascist Germany and Italy. Italian fascism and German National Socialism look upon non-national modernist architecture as hostile and in any case as alien, Okhitovich said. Okhitovich explained that the fascists used the glorification of old nationalist forms in architecture as a means to dupe the nationalistically inclined masses into supporting their political program. The work of the constructivists and formalists, on the other hand, was tied, he declared, to the success of the revolution and the ability of Russia finally to share fully in European culture, unquote. That of course was completely erroneous reasoning anyway, because fascist culture was never truly national to Germany or Italy, but was decadent imperialist culture that was alien to all peoples and all nations. German Nazism was actually not national, but was cosmopolitan. It advocated a so-called European New Order, which denied the development of national culture by all nations, and wanted to replace all national culture by a culture supposedly based on race or tribe, with a totally fabricated history. The Nazis claimed that they belonged to a so-called Aryan race, which supposedly originated from Atlantis. It sounds ridiculous, but that is actually what they believed. So what kind of national culture could develop when the whole nationhood and national history was warped and distorted in that way? The fascists went further in such fabrication than most other capitalist governments. You can clearly see how Okhitovich's view basically develops out of Trotskyism, when he says that any kind of national self-determination is fascism, and socialism in one country is also supposedly nationalist, whereas he claims that the modernists, constructivists, formalists, that they are banking on the success of the European Revolution or the World Revolution. Just like Trotsky was saying that if the European Revolution doesn't happen very soon and save the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union is basically ruined. The constructivists said the same thing. The writer Hudson reveals his anti-communist and pro-Trotsky bias, but still, he cannot save Trotskyism and Okhitovich from being clearly shown as reactionary. He writes, quote, having revealed the neo-feudal and fascist character of Stalinist architecture, so again, this is how Hudson is claiming that Okhitovich is destroying Stalinism and showing that it's fascist. So having revealed the neo-feudal and fascist character of Stalinist architecture, Okhitovich returned to his thesis of the central role of housing in a socialist-built environment. And here Okhitovich hit hard against the entire thrust of Stalinism. He accused the party of carrying out a capitalist counter-revolution by destroying the land ownership of the peasantry, unquote. So he's saying that collectivization of agriculture means a capitalist counter-revolution. The program of the Trotsky-Bukharin opposition also was that they opposed the collectivization of agriculture. Sometimes in words they said that they actually want collectivization of agriculture, but they claim that Stalin is just doing it wrong. But in practice they always said that it should be halted for one reason or another. Quote, the party group condemned Okhitovich for defrauding them into believing him to be a party member and thus obtaining permission to present his Trotskyist paper. although Okhitovich had been previously expelled from the party. It next condemned him for not having a diploma in architecture, but nonetheless passing himself off as an architect, unquote. Quote, by the end of 1934, however, a new central theme was emerging. Along with the by now perennial concerns with the reconstruction of cities and the training of more highly qualified architects, in all the agendas for the Congress, both central and regional, the question of the construction and planning of the collective farm village commanded central attention, with proposed speeches with such titles as Construction of Movie Cinemas, Houses of the Collectivists, and Construction of Schools, Hospitals, and Kindergartens, unquote. And Hudson again shows his pro-Trotsky bias. He continues, quote, as discussed previously, Okhitovich was arguing during the winter of 1934 to 35 that the single-family peasant home was the true basis for a socialist architecture in the village, and by doing so, he was striking a blow at the socialist realist myth of collectivization, unquote. Lastly, a few words about the urbanist policies on the family. Soviet architect Kolli writes, quote, of the would-be urbanists of that time, the most noisy was a certain economist Sapsovich. Who does not remember the graphic embodiment of his concept in numerous projects of communal houses, which represented a kind of parody of the phalansteries of the utopian socialists, with endless corridors, with boxes for sleeping, and special boarding schools for children, unquote. Crawford writes, quote, Nadezhda Krupskaya vigorously disapproved of separating children from their parents. Krupskaya was not the only Soviet thought leader to question the utility of breaking filial ties. Krupskaya, for her part, stressed that cross-generational interaction was of benefit to both children and adults, and not just in the transitional period. When people talk about kids, they often seem to be thinking of them as disorganized, hooligan-like interferers, she wrote. But the new socialist house should be organized so that kids can grow in it, develop, learn from adults how to organize themselves, without annoying or disturbing anyone. And of course, when building, you cannot economize on every centimeter. It is necessary to sew the housing clothes for cultural growth, anticipating the development of the inner life of the house, its social life, unquote. That's a very good point, although Marx and Engels explained that the old type of family would wither away when we transition to socialism and to communism, and eventually the entire society would basically become like one big family. Maybe not entirely literally, but something like that. And society would basically take over a lot of what private families do now. This idea that children should just be separated from their parents, I don't really think it comes from Marx. I've never seen Marx saying anything like that. Marx and Engels talk about how the family and child rearing was in primitive communism, and obviously in primitive communism, the children were not separated from the rest of the community, and Krupskaya is saying that would be a bad idea in any case. The Bolshevik Party quite correctly noted that the family would continue to exist and would serve a progressive function for a while, and this was because 1. People could not be forced to dissolve their families against their will, and 2. The state didn't have resources to handle all the necessary functions which the family performs in society currently. Therefore, the family was made responsible for caring for its members, but society would help the family in that task. Over time, the sphere of the family, so to say, would expand so that people would start taking care of each other more broadly and not only taking care of their immediate blood relatives. And the state would increasingly start taking over various functions which the family previously had to perform by providing childcare in public institutions, providing public catering to provide some of the family's meals, although the families would still have their own kitchens too if they wanted to cook food. Public laundries would wash at least part of the family's laundry. Again, the family could still wash their laundry themselves too, if they wanted to. At the same time, all adult members of the family were encouraged to study and work, and not remain stuck in the home. However, the complete and immediate destruction of the family was rejected by the Bolsheviks.